I have to admit that it's for me a bit difficult to talk about Rosa Luxemburg in English, because I'm reading all the stuff, of course, in German, and so I hope that I get the quotations, the quotes and everything right. Well, just to start, I think there's hardly no one on the left in Germany today that would not refer positively to Rosa Luxemburg. And for example, the Left Party, which was founded 12 years ago as a merger of the former post-Stalinist PDS and the West German party WASG, formed by Social Democratic Trade Union functionaries and also like small radical and revolutionary groups, is linked to a foundation named after Rosa Luxemburg. But her popularity is reaching far beyond that. Often, people just take quotes or pick quotes of Rosa Luxemburg, for example, the Greens had a poster during the 1980s with the slogan of Rosa Luxemburg: "Freedom is always the freedom of those who think differently." But this was totally disconnected from the rest of what she wrote. And this slogan was also popular with some opposition members in the GDR, which they appeared on the ritualized memorial march for Rosa Luxemburg in 1988, before they were arrested by the Stasi. And this march actually survived the GDR, this Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht Memorial March, to commemorate the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, and takes place every year around the second weekend in January in Berlin, with like tens of thousands of people participating, and today people come voluntarily. There were always really tens of thousands, and drop a carnation at the grave, and this became to a big, like, radical left demonstration at the place where the bodies of Luxemburg and Liebknecht were supposed to thrown in the Landwehr Canal in 1919 after they had been murdered. There's a monument. Actually, the CDU, the Conservatives, were hard fighting against it in the 1980s when it was erected. Or we still have today a subway station and a big street named after Rosa Luxemburg in the eastern part of Berlin. So I think that Rosa Luxemburg is quite popular, quite well known. Even though I just learned that in the exhibition in the Museum of German History in Berlin, there's a new exhibition on the Weimar Republic. So Rosa Luxemburg is not mentioned, what many people who are visiting are complaining about. But she is quite known and quite popular and has a very positive image. And it seems today that she stands for the freedom of those who think differently. But, this is disconnected from many of the things she wrote and she stood and fought for. She was against the war, while Social Democracy, the party she belonged to, agreed to the war credits in 1914. She was much more than just a left-wing Democrat. She was a revolutionary socialist, a fighter at a time when women did not even have the limited right to vote. And she stood for class struggle, and the opponents regarded her as a dangerous rebel who brought about the Civil War. She was really seen as a danger. She stood so far to the left that the SPD, or within the SPD, that the majority of the party in the German Revolution of 1918 succeeded in keeping her out of the central events of the newly founded Central Workers and Soldiers Council by vote, and with her also Karl Liebknecht. And at the end, in 1918, after the outbreak of the revolution in Germany, so there were posters on the walls saying, "Beat the leaders of the revolution to death." And so it came. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were captured and murdered in the January 1919 by a division under the leadership of the right-wing captain Waldemar Pabst after the failed insurrection of tens of thousands. Gustav Noske, the Social Democrat who served as the liaison between the right-wing counter-revolutionary Free Corps and the Social Democratic government, gave the green light to their murder by telephone. So the historical, genuine Rosa Luxemburg stands in the contrast to the Rosa Luxemburg that is perceived today. And I just want to add some biographical notes just to have an idea about this outstanding person. And I really, I want to recommend this graphic novel by Kate Evans. So it's available in German, in English. I think it's written in English and in French as well. So to get an idea, a very lively idea of her short life. She was born in 1871 in Poland at a time where Poland did not exist as an independent state, but was divided into three parts: Prussia, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Tsarist Russia. And Rosa Luxemburg was born in the Russian-occupied Poland as a daughter of a timber merchant, and she felt oppression at the first hand. So the Polish national movement, the Jewish population, and also the first free trade unions were brutally persecuted, and women did not have the right to study at university. So Luxemburg, however talented she was, was limited in her forthcoming, and also coming from a Jewish family, being a woman, so she and being a socialist, or becoming a socialist, she felt this repression very, very directly. So under this Tsarist rule, she had no perspective, and like other women at that time, she was drawn to the West, to Switzerland, to study. However, she began to become politically active in Poland. In 1893, she co-founded the Social Democratic Party in Poland, in Lithuania, and the party saw itself as a revolutionary party at that time. And when later she came to Berlin in 1899, she immediately plunged into the work for the German Social Democratic Party, and within the SPD she stood on the left wing. And she realized earlier than many others how much the bureaucratization of the party paralyzed her fighting spirit, despite all the socialist confessions she heard. One must add that even despite the fact that the SPD was a genuine workers' party at the time, with deep root in the mass unions and a very active base, so it was much more left from what we know these days as social democratic parties. So when World War I broke out in 1914, there were mass demonstrations against the impending war, led by the SPD. But then on August the 4th, Luxemburg was suddenly alone, or seemed to be alone, after the Social Democratic deputies in the Reichstag all agreed on the war loans or the war credits. I think there were 15 against in the parliamentary group, but they weren't able to articulate their minority position, and so they subordinated under the majority position. And it was in the December when Liebknecht voted against further war credits. Luxemburg assembled a group of revolutionaries in her flat to start to organize the opposition within the SPD, and Liebknecht then joined this group, and this was the origin of the Spartacus League, which was founded in 1916 as war fatigue increased. So the SPD excluded a series of members who no longer wanted to take the war course, and this led to the formation of the Independent Social Democratic Party, the USPD, and the Spartacus League retained its independence within the USPD, and was indeed it was then indeed in the revolution that broke out in November 1918. So that sealed the end of the war. During this turbulent period in the New Year's Eve in 1918. We saw the emergence of the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany, from the Spartacus League, and also, although Luxemburg was criticized many of the still, abundant sectarian views within the young KPD, she was elected into its leadership. 2 weeks later, after this premature uprising I mentioned before in Berlin failed, of which Luxemburg warned as premature, she was murdered together with Liebknecht by counter-revolutionary troops. I want now to just work out some aspects of her contribution to the revolutionary socialist tradition. And to be honest, it's quite difficult to pick and choose some aspects, because she really contributed in many important ways to many debates. Just to give you an example, I won't go deeper in it. She has a very good wrote a very good pamphlet on how to relate to religion and to people of religious beliefs of people. So I won't talk about this, but so you can pick and choose different aspects. But I think a core contribution of Rosa Luxemburg is the question of reform and revolution. And I actually want to recommend also the book I saw there with a collection of Rosa Luxemburg's works, newly edited and printed, and encourage you to read it, because it's really very readable. And I think the question of reform and revolution is a core contribution, which is important for us today to learn from. This struggle against reformism runs like a thread through the entire work of Rosa Luxemburg. So what does reformism mean? And she said that it's the limitation of the aims of the workers' movement to those aims which can be achieved within capitalism, or which can supposedly be achieved. Luxemburg, on the other hand, took the view that capitalism had to be overthrown to achieve and even to achieve goals. Eduard Bernstein was the most prominent spokesperson for reformism, and her opponent within the SPD, and it must be said that much of what Bernstein has said sounds by today's standards quite left-wing social democratic or socialist, but the situation was different then, so the SPD saw itself as a Marxist party with a Marxist program. And Bernstein's important thesis was the SPD must be a democratic socialist reform party instead of a party of social revolution. And he justified this with the view that the contradictions in capitalism were not intensifying, but were constantly becoming less sharp. And capitalism was becoming even more tame and more acceptable. Thus, in the increasing concentration of capital and monopoly-like structures such as cartels, trusts, and credit institutions would gradually throw out the anarchic structure of the system of fixed rules. And the system, the result of the overcoming of, and the result of this should be the, or would be the overcoming of the crisis of capitalism. So this was what Bernstein said. Luxemburg, on the other hand, said that monopoly organizations and banks deepen the contradictions in capitalism, and they deepen the contradiction between the international character of the capitalist world economy and the national character of the capitalist states by having a general tariff war as a side effect, and thus pushing the antagonisms between the individual capitalist states to extremes. So she contributes to the Marxist theory of imperialism. Bernstein's trump card for this argument was that the contradiction of capitalism were diminishing because it had, at that time where they had this dispute, had not experienced a major crisis for 2 decades, which was, since the year 1873. But to quote Rosa Luxemburg, she said, in 1998, Bernstein had barely thrown Marx's theory of the crisis to the scrap when a general violent crisis broke out in 1900, and 7 years later, in 1907, a new crisis came from the United States to the world market. And so it was quite clear that, that Bernstein had abandoned the core of the theory of the cycle of economic to decline. So I think this is very important that to start from that point. Rosa Luxemburg as well stressed very strong the role of the mass strike, inspired by the revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1905, and pronouncing the rising self-confidence of class consciousness through revolution. And she also stressed how the political and the economical struggles are feeding each other. I don't want to go, because my time is limited, go into this aspect deeper, but I think comrades can add further thoughts about her conception of or her ideas about the role of mass strikes in the debate. I want to stress another aspect when she talked about the character and the role of the trade unions, because this is also linked to the question of reform and revolution. So Bernstein saw the trade unions as a weapon to weaken capitalism. But Rosa Luxemburg, on the other hand, took the view that while the trade unions have some influence, of course, on wage levels, they cannot eliminate so the core problem. They can't they can't eliminate the economic factors that determine wage levels. She said, quotation, "The trade unions are nothing as the organized defensive of the labor force against the attacks of profit, as the defense of the working class against the oppressive tendency of capitalist economy. And she described the trade union struggle as a kind of Sisyphus work. And she added, this Sisyphus work, however, indispensable if the worker is to achieve the wage rate he is entitled to according to the respect market situation, if the capitalist wage law is to be implemented and the effect of the depressing tendency of economic development is to be paralyzed or more precisely weakened. So she says that it's a kind of, it's a Sisyphus work, but it's important to increase the strength and the capability of fighting of the working class. But of course, this comparison, Sisyphus work, this expression made the German trade union bureaucrats furious, and they could not admit that the trade union struggle, useful as it was to protect the workers from capital, from the capitalist, could not replace the fight for the revolutionary fight for the liberation of the working class. So I think it's important for the understanding of the role of like reformism and also like trade union bureaucracy today, as reformism itself has an objective root. It is the expression of the class position of the bureaucracy which negotiates the conditions of exploitation between labor and capital. And so I think this is also an aspect that's important for our day-to-day struggles. Luxemburg also had a radical view on the role of the state, and connected to this, the limited possibilities of changing things on the parliamentary path. And she reflected on the question of the conquest of political power while she was looking at France in June 1899, where Alexandre Miron joined the radical Val-de-Grosseau government and sat next to General Gallifet, the butcher of the Paris Commune. So, and this practice of joining the government was welcomed as well by the French socialist leader Jaurès and the reformist of the right wing in the Social Democratic, who thought that it was a great tactical turning point to not leave the political power to the bourgeoisie alone. And Luxembourg watched this experiment very carefully of the first coalition government of capitalist and socialist party, and she argued that by tying the working class to the government, the coalition prevents the working class from showing its real power. And she wrote that social democracy is inherently predestined to play the role of an oppositional party. Well, I think this is very important also for our debate in Germany, to be honest. We have just fourth federal state where the Die Linke is going to be part of a government together with the nowadays Social Democracy and the Green Party, so we are far from the position Rosa Luxemburg took at that time. I just want to add, because I really love those quotations so much, I just want to give you so in this context, like two. You have to listen to it and maybe to read it afterwards. I think that she describes very good the role of reform and revolution. And she wrote in Reform and Revolution, every legal constitution is the product of a revolution. Legislative reform and revolution are not different methods of historic development that can be picked out of the pleasure from the counter of history, just as one chooses hot or cold sausages. Legislative reform and revolution are different factors in the development of class society. They condition and complement each other and are at the same time reciprocally exclusive, as are the North and the South Poles, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And I think this is a very sharp description of the differences between reform and revolution. So revolution is not a long-stretched reform, but it's a different, it's a different fact. And the second quotation I want to give you, because it's. And this applies to the discussion of making deals, like parliamentary deals, for example, in the coalition government. So you get one demand fulfilled, but you have to give the coalition partner another thing. So, for example, in Bremen, so the city where we are, the Left Party is now going into government. There are some concessions about like education politics, but generally they had to accept the debt break. So, here, precisely, and Rosa Luxemburg writes, precisely because we do not yield 1 inch from our position, we force the government and the bourgeois parties to concede to us the few immediate successes that can be gained. But if we begin to chase after what is possible, according to the principles of opportunism, unconcerned with our own principles, and by means of statements like barter, then we will find soon ourselves in the same situation as the hunter, who has not only failed to stay the deer, but has also lost his gun in the process. So, I like that one. So I think, So I think we can take a lot of it, apply it to the nowadays discussion. So to summarize, so the revolution is not a long-stretched reform, but necessary to gain successes, and every progress you are gaining can be questioned again and again, either by the next crisis or simply by the permanent resistance of the ruling class, which sees its interests threatened. It's interesting also for the debate we had with Chris Williamson on Friday evening. The path is not the goal, and anyone who claims that is not only revealing the goal, but it's also taking another path. And so I think it's also important. It's not just a question of like pure arguments, but revolutionaries are the best reformers, because even the reforms we advocate are best achieved if we pursue our interest unyieldingly and do not bind them to the interest of capital. And so I think it's not just a question of a future perspective, but an important precondition to really gaining the next step. Thirdly, the state is not neutral, and when leftists go into government, they can at best influence legislation like a little bit, but they won't change the class character of the state institution. At the end, and I think this is also an important conclusion, and experience shows that socialists that are going into government are changed more by capital and its state than by changing capital and the state. And so this evening we will see the outcome of the Greek election, and the likely defeat of Alexis Tsipras, who was elected with great hope, by working people in working class people in Greece, and I think this is a very strong example. I want to just mention a last point, because this is a key question also for us, and also connected to the other question. I think her fight against the war was another very important aspect of her, is another important aspect of her political legacy. As we are still fighting imperialist wars, and as we are only also fighting different arguments why leftists have to support wars in a certain situation. So we had a huge debate over years about humanitarian interventionism. We had Rosa Luxemburg had to argue and to struggle against the arguments of the right-wing social democracy that we can't we can't stand aside like the war, and we can't deny or vote against the war credits. And so I think her brave fight that brought her into prison and brought her into the political isolation in social democracy in the first years is a very important point for us for the nowadays debates. I think, to sum up, it is a tragedy that Rosa Luxemburg didn't build a revolutionary organization in time, and so suffered isolation, and also the situation that the KPD was not experienced enough, and also in a, well, to be honest, very difficult and very chaotic situation where it's difficult to really do, or it's easy to make the comment from the past, like 100 years afterwards, but it shows that it would have been necessary to discuss these questions before, and I think it's important for us to take on these experiences the revolutionaries and Rosa Luxemburg made in Germany in the early 20th century. And I think, but it's important to say, this doesn't make her great contribution smaller as a contributor to Marxist theory, as an activist and also an organizer, and as a woman that, with bravery and also empathy, fought for her ideas and principles. And I think Rosa Luxemburg is needed in a time of the radicalization of contradictions, of fundamental problems of like humanity, the climate catastrophe, but also the social and economic contradictions and immense poverty, the threat of war we are facing. And so I think she is a must-read for the upcoming struggles.